Welcome everybody at this Feminist Spatial Practice panel discussion that we have been looking forward to for quite some time now, and we have worked towards it through the book club and the podcasts. My name is Indira van 't Klooster, the director of Arcam, the Architecture Center of Amsterdam, and today we are closing the Architecture in Residency of Afaina de Jong. The Architect in Residency is a program in which Arcam offers a platform for fascinations of architects to explore further, or for research to bring to a wider audience in general. And before, for example, we had Dojana Vermeulen, who is now working on the highest wooden tower in Amsterdam, but was then exploring the design issues in smart city topics. We had Mark Köhler, who launched his open building platform through the Architecture in Residency, and Liongo Juliana, who opened up the debate on a more diverse way of planning and making floor plans in dwellings, as well as diversifying the spatial practice of the architect itself. Afaina de Jong is our architect in residence since 2020, November 2020, and started Afarai since 2005, an architecture practice with the aim to cross boundaries and to with an intersectionalist and interdisciplinary approach to represent people and movements that are not traditionally represented in architecture. She was also a teacher at the Technical University in Delft, now in Vienna. She's the curator of the Venice Architecture Biennale Dutch Pavilion, and made some beautiful exhibition designs in several museums around the world. And her topic for the Architect in Residency was a few questions like, what is a feminist practice? Why is it important? And how can we implement it in architecture? To explore this further, she has launched a book club, and I think we have quite a lot of them, the participants of the book club from before present in today's discussion as well as a podcast series, which is online at the Arcam website. For all the people that were present in the book club before, I think it's important to mention that this session will be recorded, contrary to the previous sessions, which are all private. This one will be public and recorded. So for today, I would like to present three of the authors that we have been reading and discussing in the past months, and whom we greatly admire and we learned from a lot as thinkers, theoretics, professors, lecturers on professions that are outside architecture but are really very relevant to it. First of all, I would like to introduce Leslie Kern. She is an assistant professor of geography and environment at the Mount Allison University in Sackville, Canada. Her work focuses on urban and social issues, on gender and gentrification, and she is the author of Feminist City, Claiming Space in a Man-Made World, a book which is both empirical as an invitation to look around and to be aware. And what I liked about the podcast that she did with Afaina earlier this month is her notion on how the city does actually impact on different groups regarding gender, race, ability, and age, and how she notes that the city is not accessible to all on all these levels, which at the end of it affect all of us, because we all benefit from a city that is safe and equal and open and accessible to all. Leslie, just a quick question before I introduce the other speakers today. You deliberately wrote your book from an empirical point of view. You even start the book with very personal experiences, and I think even the first word is I. So I think it's important for you to make this this book also on a personal level. Why was that?
I see it as part of a long feminist tradition of starting from the everyday, starting from women's actual experiences, starting from our embodied experiences, and thinking about what kinds of new questions, practices, concepts, and so on can be generated when we start not from the abstract or from the city as a whole, but when we start from what some have called the geography closest in the body itself.
Thank you, Leslie. We will definitely talk about that later on in this talk. The next guest that we are very happy to welcome is Brady Burrows. She is an architect and also a teacher at the KTH University in Stockholm, Sweden. Part of the collective Fatal, author and collaborator in Architectural Flirtations, which is a series of essays on critical theory, queer, gender, race, and intersectionalism, which actually has a lot of humor too. And today you are here because of your very interesting publication, which was called Ahmed for Architecture Students, using Ahmed's vocabulary to raise awareness and to offer almost literally a safe space for architecture students to talk about how their personal experiences also affect their profession as an architect. I mentioned this before, that we do have a Pritzker Prize for architects, but we should have a Pritzker Prize for architecture teachers as well. And I think the first one should definitely go to you, because it is so important to make this accessible and dense work of Sarah Ahmed, who is one of the leading voices in feminist theory, race and gender, and to make it also accessible to the architecture student as such, but also to help them to become aware of how specific mechanisms might work, and how they can use that to develop a new vocabulary in architecture and design. Question for you, because Sarah Ahmed, of course, is very important for inventing a new vocabulary on how we could talk about matters on race and gender. And you mentioned in the podcast you did with Afaina last week that willfulness and orientations were your favorite words. Could you explain a bit more about that?
Sure. I think first I just would like to say that it's important that I'm a co-author of this with the architecture students that participated. But willfulness and orientations, I think what's really nice with Ahmed's theory, and specifically these concepts, is that I think Sarah Ahmed writes in a very phenomenological way. So she takes a concept and then she writes sort of in circles. So she writes from all these different angles. And I think it's very applicable for architects, because many architecture schools are so affected by this phenomenological thinking in the program, and used to looking at something. And she looks at a concept from a circle around gender, and then she takes a circle around sexuality, and then she takes a circle around with race, and that becomes this intersectionality through a concept. So, and I think that's a really nice tool to then look at our practice and look at our values.
Thank you so much. The next and last guest in this talk is Nirmal Puwar, a sociologist by profession from Goldsmith University in London, also the co-director of the Methods Lab and a specialist on race and gender methodologies, and maybe most importantly for today as well, the author of Space Invaders. And what I find fascinating is that this book was already written in 2004, and that it's still gaining importance and weight in the debate on today's issues, with the concepts that come from your book, like seen, unseen, public, private, doubt and representation, insider, outsider, all ways to research how the male white body has succeeded in presenting itself as something universal or as the norm. And what is very important and groundbreaking in your book is how Space Invaders is also offering a method to take back that space. And so that's why it was a very important book for us to read as well in our book club. And I was wondering, before we take the conversation a bit further, that how in your book in Space Invaders that architecture itself is almost extremely present as a bodily form, but also as a building, which of course is, from the point of view of architecture, really important. And you mentioned the example of the Parliament building in London. Could you explain to the audience a bit how this building, how this architecture kind of exemplifies bodily, embodies this universal norm?
Yeah, thank you for the invitation to be part of this panel. Yeah, maybe I can go back to the day when I walked into Parliament for the first time. I didn't actually visit as a student, as many schools do. And when I walked in as a researcher to interview women and people of colour, men and women, I could feel this sense of the weight of the past around me. And it's in the architecture. You know, there are imperial images painted to constitute a certain narrative of the nation as soon as you step into the hall. And all around you, in the way in which bodies are situated in relation to each other, you have the service staff dressed up. They look like they're something out of the 19th century. So this place is a kind of a meshing of the feudal gentrified classes and the bourgeoisie. In many ways, it's like a museum, but it's a working museum, and it does affect everyday practices. So my work's really been focused on thinking about what happens when the bodies for whom the space wasn't designed, because it was designed for specific masculinities. In many ways, it's a front room for certain gentrified masculine figures. So that's changed over time. And I look at, well, what happens? What's a disturbance when new bodies arrive for whom the space isn't constituted? And I think it's a really illuminating moment, because it actually shows how the space has been constituted in the first place, for whom it's been constituted, the shape of it, the texture of it. Yeah, so that's there, always present. And the architecture of the place cannot be taken away in how you place any figures in there. It's very present.
Yeah, and in the podcast conversation you had with Afaina last week, you explained how you have interviewed hundreds of women who described the experience of working there, of being there, of try to do their jobs there. And you also mentioned the weight of the past. Do you think a lot has changed since the Parliament buildings, or are contemporary buildings more or less doing the same thing? Yeah,
no, I think it would be an oversight to say nothing's changed. Certainly the numbers of people of different bodies, of women, people of colour, there's an increase, and there's a big change that's happening in terms of who is the normative figure. That figure is kind of changing, but the normative figure is also quite stable. Whereas when you get a person of colour or woman, and you do have them in those roles in increasing numbers, they still are superimposed onto the masculine figure, who is still the yardstick by which people are measured. So the masculine figure, we know, can make numerous mistakes and they're not picked up because they are the normative body. That's one example. Whereas the new, relatively new bodies, any slight mistake, it's picked up and elaborated, and there's a sense of super surveillance. And I take that theorization from Frantz Fanon when he talks about a doctor in Paris. If he makes any mistakes in the 1950s, that's it. They'll say no more doctors from, you know, Martinique. They just can't do the job. So there's this burden of doubt that people exist in. But at the same time, we can't project that they are, the newcomers are homogenous anyway, because we're not. You know, the different politics, different trajectories in there, in the manifestation. Yeah, I did do 100 interviews with MPs and senior civil servants, and spent 1 year trying to say something with these very contradictory voices, which is what data is there for.
And maybe Afaina, before we open up the conversation into more general questions, a quick word for you as well, because you brought together all these very interesting women and researchers that have actually never participated in the same panel before. So you have made something happen that's quite unique. And maybe the whole way you worked on your architect in residency was quite unique and specific. So a few words for you, maybe to explain a bit on how we got here.
On how we got here. Yeah. I mean, I guess the question to me was, you want to do an architecture in residency. Is there anything you would like to research? And I felt that was a little bit like a very concrete question, like a certain topic or something with plans and sections. And I think what I really wanted to kind of dive into was, well, the books that I was reading, you know, or kind of the meta, you know, like what is happening before we start to design. And I mean, I also wasn't interested in kind of being the sole author of this grand research on feminist spatial practice, because I think it's something that is been developing over decades, maybe even centuries, you know, and it's not something of one person. So what I really wanted to do is kind of share my world and think with other people. And explore with other people. So I think the book club was a great place where, where a lot of people came together, you know, and we just had an open conversation. It really wasn't about what I thought about the book, but really what we could find together. So in that sense, I also try to not say that much, but really be part of the conversation, not only be like, well, this is what I found, what did you find? I think that's wrong. But and I think that was lovely, you know, and even like then being able to speak with the 3 authors of this publication made it even better, because then after, you know, kind of reading it together, you kind of get to hear from the author herself. What her intentions or what she sees. So yeah, for me, it's been the best research ever. And maybe you shouldn't call it a research, you know, I really see it more as a collaborative, I don't know, process of mining and thinking and talking. And I really feel, what I also liked about the book clubs was that it was intergenerational, you know, that we have architects from, well, generations before, I mean, maybe it's not even before, but, you know, many different ages coming together and kind of reevaluating also what steps have been successful, what didn't work, and maybe where we are finally at. Like, can we, some of the ideas that were there before, how do they gain momentum now, you know? So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah.
It definitely does. And also you did some groundbreaking forward already, because in the podcast you had with Brady and Leslie and Nirmal, you asked them a quite direct answer on the main question of your residency, which is what is a feminist practice, or what could it look like, and how could it how could you, from feminist theory, bring this into practice, into an architectural practice? And all three actually answered your question. So I thought it would be interesting to compare the answers, and then also maybe you can respond to each other and interact in conversation. And this is also an invitation to the audience, because we know that most of you are quite well informed on many of these topics. So we really, really welcome you to ask questions or to join the conversation. Questions is of course quite simple. They can be posed through the Q&A through the Q&A. If you want to say something, we can also highlight you and you can become part of the panel. So that's quite simple to arrange, and then through the Arcam host, which is of course Isana, that you know very well. Okay, so what is a feminist practice to you? That is the question, Afaina, that you asked, for example, to Leslie. And Leslie, you said maybe a feminist practice is about blurring boundaries. Could you explain a bit more about that?
Yeah, so I was thinking about the way in which we kind of in the Western world kind of structure our thinking about so many things around binaries, right? So, you know, the gender binary is an obvious one that we could think of, but even in buildings, we think about private space versus public space. We think about the family versus everyone else, home versus work, safety versus danger, community versus individual. We have very dualistic ways of thinking about the world. And I think again, feminism in general has been a project of trying to challenge those binaries and the systems of power that they uphold. And sometimes that means kind of flipping the binary around, or it means expanding it so it's no longer a binary, which is what we've been doing with gender now for a long time. And also sometimes just kind of trying to blur these things, or to recognize that they're much more permeable than we think. So I think spatially, public and private is a good one to think about as blurring. I think during the pandemic, most people have found that what they maybe took for granted as public versus private has been shaken up quite a lot. Similarly, home and work are no longer these distinct places for many of us. So I think a feminist spatial practice is one that tries to both, you know, question what these binaries are, think about what they uphold in terms of power and inequality, and then approach them critically, sometimes with the view maybe just to smashing them all together and seeing what emerges when we try to rebuild something differently.
What to you is a good example of that? Do you know a place or a building or a square, maybe in Toronto or elsewhere, that kind of illustrates a non-binary space?
That's a good question.
If it exists at all, maybe it doesn't.
Yeah, well, I'm sure that it does exist. I mean, I'm thinking of maybe more scenarios where we have like community centers, for example, that we, you know, maybe think of as public spaces, but they also take on some of the roles that are traditionally seen as private roles. So, for example, like community kitchens or food programs in community centers where, for example, like immigrant women come together to cook meals for one another and for, you know, more marginalized members of the community. So there's kind of like care functions happening in public spaces. So instead of all of that just happening in the private space of the home and the public being about work and politics and whatever, there's a bit of that blurring where we kind of bring some of those private functions out into public space and share them, collectivize them.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. And maybe it also connects to what Brady mentioned as an answer to this question, because you said, Brady, you said a feminist practice is able to create space a space as in deep collaboration. Could you elaborate a bit more on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think spaces of collaboration. I think I of course work in the school, and I think there are a lot of lingering ideas about architectural practice in terms of that it's an individual project. There's a lot of competition. There's this idea that that it's sort of this boot camp mentality still in the studios where, you know, you work all night. And I think setting a tone for how we want to practice architecture in terms of, you know, maybe collaborations are a good thing. I think being conscious, and this another thing that I think both Nirmal and Leslie brought up with the ideas that other people have these, maybe care is also a part of it, that, you know, some people have other obligations where they have to have care outside of what they're doing, their practice, and that the practice should still be viable for an individual. If someone has to work, if someone has to, you know, I think we set the tone in the schools of what this collaborative practice can be, and that then is carried into practices and then carried back to the schools through the teaching. So.
And what do you think in the sessions you had with the students, because especially in the book that or the fanzine basically that you made for about Sarah Ahmed is also about this kind of self-research and becoming aware of all the things you don't see.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the biggest obstacles in the beginning was that, the group was really angry with me and with Sarah Ahmed the first few sessions, because they said, this makes me feel stupid. You know, this theory, you know, I can't understand it, and I don't want to participate in the discussion because it makes me feel dumb. Because it's in a language that I don't know how to decode, you know, or they weren't used to reading theory. They weren't used to reading theoretical texts. And I think the thing that was nice is that by persisting and having sort of this, you know, each session we said, okay, you can say that, you can, you know, having an open atmosphere where we can talk about that as well. But then also giving them the tools, just like we do when we teach them to, you know, to do plans and sections. They need the tools to read theory, which you don't always get in architecture schools. And by the end, you know, they were throwing theoretical arguments around, you know, like prose, and they loved it. You know, they really loved it. And I think also we saw a development in Sarah Ahmed's work. We started with her work in, I think, 2004, and we ended with 2017, and her writing became different as well. And that was also something that we could see, that, okay, if you write in a different way, it's also makes a difference in what you can take in. You know, these students are designers, they're not, you know, necessarily scholars. So, and it was something that they really, I still have contact with several of them that they use today, which is really, really nice. And then the collaboration part is, at the end, they prepared these parts of the fanzine in groups, but then we had a peer review of each other's group. And then I did an editing of it and then asked them to check my editing. So we had a lot of exchange where we talked about, okay, is this what you meant? Because I was a very heavy-handed editor in a lot of cases. You know, I was like, okay, is this okay? And so I think that process was really important.
It strikes me now, Afaina, the similarities between how you set up the book club and how Brady did the sessions with the students, in both in creating this safe space and room for investigation, or exploring all these new concepts and words, and at the same time also sharing the knowledge that we do have, or that could be quite different to different participants of the book club. Nirmal, your answer to what a feminist practice to you would mean was that a feminist practice embraces the spatial conditions of inclusion, which is probably quite the opposite of the Parliament building in London. But maybe you could explain a bit more about what you mean with that.
Yeah, I suppose we all know that space is constituted in certain ways with particular values and bodies in mind. But most of the time, it's also altered through those who mobilize themselves through the bodies or reuse the space. So I'm really quite interested in how, and methodologically, I've been working with experimental methods on how you can disturb space so that it can be something else. And this is not something that's just for us intellectuals or for artists. In fact, people do that every day. So churches become sanctuaries for refugees, houses in suburbs become refuges for women escaping domestic violence, or they become spaces of, transgender, transmedia, as has been the case with Caracola in Madrid. So there's that thing of multiplying and repurposing and taking the space inside out. And that happens all the time, I must say, but we can push it further through our research. And I've in fact been working on projects that do that, actually, to turn the notion of remembrance around, to bring in the post-colonial body without celebrating militarism or nationalism. And to think about different narratives, but also shifting the space. So I did that on a project I collaborated with called Noise of the Past in Coventry Cathedral, which you might know is a modernist cathedral. And it has all these kind of alternative narratives, but they don't always come to the fore. So we placed Urdu poetry in there, and to think about intergenerational exchange, and to think about the global war dead. So, yeah, to place conflict in what passes as consensual, that's sort of something that we can do all the time. And I guess we can accelerate it, but it's happening all the time, the reusing of space. And there's a project I was involved with. We had a panel called The Right to the City a few weeks ago, and my colleague Phoebe from Cape Town at UCT pointed out that in her work with sex workers who were largely homeless, they would be performing, one of her participants would be performing on the bridge, it's the performance, but at the same time, the underside of the bridge is where she sleeps. And she would keep chilies in her mouth to make sure insects don't crawl in at night when she's asleep. So this is an inventiveness that's operating all the time, and people's vulnerability and marginality actually affects how they invent and how much they have to invent just to exist every day.
And because these are examples on basically maybe also how Space Invaders started. How you collect narratives and stories, experiences, and then when you have hundreds of them, start thinking about where are the similarities, or where are the methodology could kick in to see specific drivers or mechanisms. So if we talk about the right to the city or post-colonial bodies, do you see different things there than you found in Space Invaders or in Space Invaders?
Yes, I mean, I looked at very conservative spaces. I looked at the consecrated spaces of Westminster and senior civil service, and I did that deliberately, to be honest. At that point, I was in a stage of my, I wouldn't say academic career, I was just starting out as a researcher and doctoral student, where I actually felt like a parasite, because I had done a lot of research in a women's refuge as an undergraduate student. I spent 1 year, I had what's called the sandwich degree. And I wrote about, is sisterhood possible? So I wanted to turn my lens to the elites who can easily avert the academic gaze. And I still do that, actually. I kind of like dissecting them and doing a kind of anthropology of those places. But yes, it shifts. It shifts if you're thinking about different places and different modes of existence. And some people don't even have, citizenship. They don't have the documentation. They're not even legal. So how you circulate in those spaces, and also even if you're thinking about race, there's differences. There are privileged people. I'm relatively privileged. I'm a citizen. I'm a resident, and so forth. Whereas those people who have to duck and dive in different ways, their conditions of being in space are very different, and there's quite a lot of research on that. There's a journalist called Hai-Sun Pai, and she looks at invisible labourers. She often goes underground, in fact, herself. So classic ethnography, as a cleaner or a farm worker, and she brings those stories into existence. So yeah, there are different stories to be brought into existence. I must say, I'm also interested in just kind of space invading now. And sometimes that can happen just with the stories, but it also can happen with the languages you place in there, the different configurations you bring to bear. And there's a long tradition of feminist work and scholarship and theory on space invading. The most obvious cases are, classic examples like Guerrilla Girls in art galleries. But there are lots of cases of experimental space invading. So I think I keep both levels going at the same time. And one is my methodological interest in, having an input, making an intervention. And the other is looking at how others are making interventions through the stories I collect.
You mentioned the importance or how you research the informal spaces and also maybe the invisible spaces, which maybe, and I'm also looking at Brady and Leslie and Afaina now, maybe a vital element of feminist practice, because maybe formal space and traditional space is so much claimed and valorized by a male body dominance that maybe you cannot find new experience or new design tools there. Could that be the case? Is it maybe why for you informal spaces or invisible spaces are important, Afaina?
Oh, for me, yeah. I think those spaces always gave me a lot of input, that I wasn't getting in from kind of architectural practice. And I just always felt that we have a very limited set of tools or information, even, sets of information that we use when we're designing. So for me, really, what people do on street level and, their walks of life, like all of these complexities, I just found way more interesting. And we often approach like most spaces as kind of physical empty space, but I really feel that, if we look at those, what happens in these kind of informal settings, it's actually information that is made by people, and yeah, we should be kind of able to read that as architects, right? But we're really, like Brady was also saying, you know, like certain tools we do not have yet. You know, it's like we can draw, but we can't read theory, and we also can't really read what is happening in the streets, you know, like spatial practice, informal practice, like a spatial cultural practice that people do. We do not know how to use that info. So I think that's very important to develop, yeah.
Is that Brady, for example, because these non-designed or these invisible informal spaces are also non-designed spaces, and maybe also as Nirmal says, these space invading tools can also maybe become design tools. Did you find evidence for that in the sessions with your students or in the work of Sarah Ahmed?
I think can you clarify a little bit?
Well, if informal and invisible spaces are usually also non-designed spaces, so there is no master plan, there is no architect, there is no urban planner who decides which happens where and how. It doesn't. So a good point is it doesn't exclude anything or anyone or anybody, but at the same time it makes things possible, and it doesn't blur our vision. So in this kind of a non-biased space, yes?
Because I think lots of these informal spatial practices actually happen in total designed spaces, right? They happen in spaces that have been designed by us or have been kind of set up by urban planners. So it is really about kind of appropriating those spaces. And then the question is like, who is actually appropriate enough to appropriate those spaces? You know, so I think those are some of the issues that we deal with, and we need kind of feminist theory also to be able to dissect that and to be able to see what is actually happening and place that in a context, and to place ourselves within a context as designers, like of where we stand, where our privilege is, our relation to power. So yeah, I think everything happens in spaces that are really designed by us and by politics and power. So yeah, we need to be aware of those structures.
Yeah.
Brady.
And I think sort of in connection to both what Nirmal is saying about the narrative and what Afaina just said, is I think a lot of those projects then become these gentrification projects to redo a space that isn't yet designed. And I think, you know, if you have one of the things that, if we take feminist theory, you know, if you have a company who wants to throw a lot of money at a project, they're likely stand to gain a lot of money at the cost of someone else. And we as architects, maybe, you know, to keep the office afloat, we make up in our minds, okay, we can't say no to this project because it's about our survival of the office or the survival of the practice. And that company who's ordering the project maybe has made up this big narrative about why it's good, you know, why we should do it and why we're so good at you know, doing this project. But I think what you can do, if you can't say no, is maybe you can use feminist theory to help you think through the project and reframe what you're being asked to do, and to maybe value what's already there, and maybe try to send it in a different direction, because feminist theory gives us the tools to think through it in a different way and to approach it in a different way. So that's where I think you can maybe try to shift it a little bit. Even if you can't not do it, you can shift it to make it better for the people who are in that space.
I think you can do that, exactly that, yes. I mean, in the academy, it's so neoliberalized, as you say, Brady. You know, it's the big scholar, the big name, the citation, the celebrity. But as we know, it's all collaboration. That's how knowledge is made. Of course, we have steers and we have legacies. one of the ways we've been multiplying the academy is we've used a corridor, Kingsway Corridor, it's the Kingsway Corridor in this very old building, and we've made it an exhibition space, but it's not an exhibition space where something comes up quickly and goes away. I usually say I'm not doing an exhibition for 2 weeks. It has to be there for 2 academic terms so that we can live with it. And then students can narrate through it and they co-create with us. We have different narratives flowing through it. And this is one of the ways you can multiply the space, but it's still, of course, you're working in the boundaries of the neoliberal university. However, we have to find these pockets, or what Fred Moten and Stefana Harney say, the undercommons. You find the undercommons in there, and to shift the learning. And there are always openings. And I must say that I think migrants always have to do it. They've always had to do it. I mean, I've looked at cinemas in the UK. When cinema going was falling, the numbers of people going was falling. In the 40s, 50s, it started falling and they started closing. Actually, in the UK, it was South Asian people who had come from India, then recently Pakistan at that time, and they bought these failing cinemas. Some of them individuals, some of them bought them as collectives, like the Indian Workers Association. And most of these people who ran them actually worked in factories. They worked on night shifts, and they became, I mean, the men were at the front, but the women were doing a lot of the work as well, creating the publicity and so on. So there's always a reuse of space. You can alter the building, and people are doing it all the time. I think they don't, so my parents' generation, they didn't think, let's go and occupy space, it's so cool. They thought about where is it possible and where is it impossible, partly down to wealth, but also politics, whereas the civic politics allowing them to be somewhere. And I think these techniques, people like me who are now professionalized are probably using the same techniques, but I have bigger resources. We think we have nothing, we have way more resources than earlier generations. So that has to be recognized as well.
For sure.
Leslie. So with all these different narratives of invisible spaces, informal spaces, and of the narrative of the great architect designing these huge works, maybe also the difference between appropriating overlooked spaces versus specifically designed spaces, as Afaina mentioned, that maybe we just don't see or don't gather well. How could you maybe reflect on yet another narrative that kind of plays a role in the architectural practice when implementing feminist practice?
Well, I'll just clarify also that I definitely am not speaking from an architect's perspective. I'm not an architect and I didn't go to architecture school, so I sometimes feel like maybe I'm speaking a bit out of turn. But I will say that from observation, again, going back to this feminist interest in the everyday, like the very everyday experiences that, can be categorized as kind of the banal, the mundane, like picking up kids from school, going grocery shopping, walking down the sidewalk, these are not the experiences, and they're often not the spaces that garner a lot of attention, right? Either from architects or planners or just even scholars of the city, right? But they are the stuff that makes up everyday life, and they are infused with power relations as well. So I think there's a lot to be said for listening to the stories of the micro interactions, for thinking about a space like the sidewalk as a site where all sorts of power relations are happening, right? And that are, infused into the very environment itself, but also into the way that people use that space, interact, access it or don't access it or can't access it. And, spaces like toilets, for example, right? I sort of joke that I don't think anybody goes to architecture school for however many years to design a really great public toilet, yet these are the kinds of spaces that make a big difference in everybody's lives, and that can determine whether someone has access to the public realm or not. And maybe, you know, I'm thinking of Nirmal's work, thinking about spaces like legislatures and parliament buildings that didn't have washrooms for women, and this was used as like an excuse for why women couldn't possibly be in parliament, because they couldn't go to the bathroom anywhere. So there's sort of this long history of toilet access being politicized in different ways, and it continues to be, you know, an ongoing issue where we think about access for transgender and non-binary people, or people who simply don't present in a stereotypical masculine or feminine gender presentation, you know, bathrooms as places of potential violence. Like, there's so much that's kind of really rich and interesting and political and important about these spaces, and yet, like, who wants to talk about toilets, right? I mean, I do, apparently. But...
Well, yeah, it's funny. We spoke about toilets a lot, actually.
Quite a lot, yeah.
I think it's really such a this space always comes up. So yeah, I don't know why, but yeah, it makes, yeah.
Yeah, so I guess a plea for thinking about the everyday, and how, again, the very like basic bodily needs of human beings sometimes are perhaps overlooked in architecture and planning. And, you know, maybe if we started from there, we would end up somewhere different than where we've gone so far.
Yeah.
I'd like to pass the word on to Joe Barnett, who asked a question in the question and answer box. But maybe, Joe, you would like to answer it live and to be highlighted by Izanne. Yeah, we can see you there. If you, yeah, exactly. Open up the camera if possible, or not, just as you like. Joe Barnett was one of the regular visitors of the book club, so quite familiar with all your work. Joe. Where did, there. Joe, please unmute.
Am I, oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah, now we can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Welcome.
Hello. I was trying to formulate a question. I sent that comment too quickly. I pressed the wrong button. But I to say was to comment on Brady's very interesting point that she was making about procurement, and that how you actually, well, as speaking as a designer, how difficult it is if the client and the people actually commissioning what you're doing don't share your vision, or that actually aren't sympathetic to your vision. But even so, I think it's so important that one, as a designer, you have the backup of the academic and the people that look at this work outside of the world of design, to help us formulate our own opinions, but also to something that we can point to that's almost like an objective narrative or an objective point of view over the use of space. I find it very difficult sometimes to engage with the client in conversations about these things. It depends who the client is, of course, but sometimes it can be quite difficult to bring into the conversation something beyond the nuts and bolts of actually completing a building. Sorry, that's not really a question, is it? But I suppose I'm just interested as an architect about having enlightened clients. Enlightened clients are a blessing.
Well, and actually they do lead to kind of enlightened buildings in terms of feminist practice, maybe, because
Sure.
You are also part of our next exhibition at Arcam, Safe Spaces, in which you give examples of how the implementation of feminist practice into architectural practice could actually lead to a new type of buildings. Could you maybe explain on, for example, the school that you designed?
All right. Well, because we were asked after the reading group to consider some of the vocabulary, and I guess one of the things that I found interesting in the Sarah Ahmed text was the term straightening device, and then we were discussing in the group, which I thought was really great. Can anybody think of anything that's a building that might not be a straightening device? And so I brought up, we were all thinking away, and we actually produced a school where children of mixed ability are all under one roof, ranging from pupils that have really special needs to mainstream children, but they're actually integrated. It's actually not one school there and one school there even under one roof, but actually we shifted the spaces around so that the children moved through the spaces of the other school, if you see what I mean. So that yes, they were following different educational paths, but in fact they mixed and mingled between them. But of course, this was an enlightened client who really, really wanted this to happen. And we were more than happy to oblige and to try and think of a way of making it to happen physically. So that was a sort of one example of a non-straightening device that I thought of. So.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing this example, Joe, because I also found it a very, very good example of how, because these two streams, let's say, meet the abled and the disabled children, as well as the differences in understanding and physical abilities and other. How they might actually learn from each other, and how it creates an environment in which there are which doesn't respond to the usual static range of requirements.
Well, I mean, one of the things I think is tolerance, because there's a wonderful school in London that I visited by Nicholas Hare, which is at the Barbican, and that was an example. I did some research a few years ago about different sorts of schools and came to London and visited various types. And that school had this kind of combination. And what was so beautiful about what I found as a designer was that it had, the schools were actually under the same roof, but they were quite physically separated. But these were children that had physical disabilities, and they would ride their special tricycles and stuff throughout the school and these extra wide corridors, and then they would just leave them in various places. So the whole school was like punctuated by all this different sorts of equipment. So children, able-bodied children, had to negotiate all these bits of pieces that other children left, which they wouldn't normally see because they don't use them because they're able-bodied. So I found that really wonderful. And I was longing to do something similar, but had luckily eventually got some sort of commission that was quite similar. But that I thought was really lovely, and how it was like the differently abled children were invading the space that they wouldn't normally be allowed in, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's actually one of the reasons why I was so much fascinated by Afaina starting this architecture in residency, because I was really curious to see what type of new architecture could come out of really trying to do a thing like this. And maybe it's just my practical mindset that goes to work like, okay, let's see, how can we learn from this? How can we design a better world, etc. But it is interesting to see how you can make it happen while designing spaces. So, Afaina, as you are the practicing architect within the panel, could you also elaborate a bit more on how you, what design tools you use to open spaces up or to make them more accessible or more inclusive?
I mean, I think for one, I try to merge, what I find in reading theory into kind of in my thinking when I start designing. And I think I really you still use it to create a framework in my mind of the context in which I'm designing, you know, because I think often it's so detached from each other, theory and practice. And I think that's really also in architecture, you know, you have the people who think and you have the people who just make buildings. But I think we kind of have to, it has to come together, you know, because otherwise, well, theory is in this world, and you know, just making buildings is also very banal. So I mean, I think that is really how I try to do it, to be able to deconstruct this world in which I'm working, you know, and not everything is what you see. And I think, you know, we're talking about decolonization, depatriarchalization of the profession, but we really need information to be able to do that, you know. And you go to architecture school and you kind of programmed. I mean, it starts in kindergarten, you're being programmed. And it really takes time to kind of get rid of certain ideas and also to see the system in which you work. So I feel that is really why we should read theory, and why I wanted to share doing that. I hope, you know, people take it forward and also start to do their own book clubs and bring in more books and other thinking. And I think, you know, because yeah, I think in architecture we just have a limited library, like you see now. You know, Leslie comes from urban geography, Ahmed comes from sociology, Nirmal also comes from sociology. So we really need like all these different fields. We need to have like empirical, you know, we need to kind of really step it up if we want to make sense of this complex world. Otherwise, we're just going to make the same building over and over and over again.
Yeah. There's another question from Magda. Magda, do you want to join the conversation in full view? If so, open up the camera. This is about the toilet design and breastfeeding rooms, for example. So maybe it is one of those practical things that indeed we have been talking about during the book club as well, which was also interesting. There she is, Magda. Can you rephrase your comment into a question to maybe one or all of our panelists?
Actually, that's a question to everyone. I think it's more of a sort of a trying to brainstorm on that topic a little bit. So I've been actually recently reading a book, Architects After Architecture, Architecture After Architects. Anyway, in one of the chapters, they mentioned the topic of the toilets and how to actually build them for, or design them for non-binary people, for breastfeeding women, for different religions, etc. And so actually this is sort of, even though it's a funny topic, I think it's really sort of the main topic, or the easiest one to sort of focus on when talking about accessible architecture in this kind of sense. But my question to everyone would be, what do you think other spaces could be on such focus list? If we could sort of try to create one, at least like the basic one that every architect should sort of focus on these days. Yes, that's my question.
Thank you, Magda. Maybe Leslie, Brady? And Nirmal will probably be back soon.
I mean, I've certainly been thinking a lot about the home, again, with the pandemic kind of showing the limitations of the single family home as the dominant model of housing in so much of the world. You know, really, this is a relatively new historical form, especially, you know, on the mass level. And it has certainly been a very challenging form, especially during this time of crisis, whether we think about domestic violence in the home, whether we think about the, you know, disproportionately gendered burdens of childcare and cleaning and healthcare and so on that happen in the home. And so, you know, I don't know the answer to this, but I think this is maybe a pivotal moment for architects who do design for the home to be thinking about what assumptions have we been taking for granted about what the family is and what the family needs? How could we broaden that to keep in mind that, you know, the nuclear family is maybe not the dominant form of household in many places now, at least not for people's entire lives. That there are a variety of different needs that the home could fulfill, and that the home is not also inherently a safe space for everybody. So I don't, again, know exactly what that looks like, but I do think it's a key moment for us to be rethinking some of the foundational assumptions that have underlaid so much of housing design in the, you know, late 20th century, early 21st.
In the podcast, Leslie, you mentioned Dolores Hayden, who is who researched the post-war suburb in America. Does this give usual leads to partly answering your questions as well?
Well, yeah, I mean, Hayden is really effective at pointing out how both the suburban family home itself and that kind of family model of the male breadwinner and woman at home was very much sort of designed to fulfill particular kind of social and economic needs at that moment. It wasn't natural in any sense of the word, and it was very much encouraged and then kind of enforced by housing policies and you know, workplace policies and so on that sort of pushed us into that form to the extent that we started to just take it for granted as the norm and as the way things should be. So I think she is someone useful to look for digging to that deeper level and saying, like, okay, you know, how has like policy, legislation, and so on actually pushed us into certain ways of living and ways of doing things that don't necessarily have to be that way. They're not, you know, natural in any meaningful way.
Thank you, Leslie, and thank you, Magda. Also from the audience is Women Make the City, which is a very nice a movement, actually, an Amsterdam movement on including feminist voices or female voices into long-term spatial planning, as well as more practical planning. I don't know who is representing Women Make the City, but maybe you would also like to join this, yeah, there she is, and ask your question on intersectional feminism.
Yes, hello.
Hi.
Oh, someone's phone's ringing. Yes, my name is Marta Singelenberg. I didn't realize I was logged in as Women Make the City, but that's nice as a context. Yeah, so we are an intersectional feminist movement in Amsterdam, and we are advising the municipality, the gemeente, on their plans for the city from this feminist perspective. So we work with yeah, like women from all over the city, and we have women's advisory boards, one for the city, one in Southeast, and now a new one in Amsterdam New West coming up. And I was wondering, I've been wanting to talk to yeah, to all of you already for a while. I'm very inspired by many of your work, about how can we, because we are kind of in this more like you know, place of advising and trying to get into, you know, all of the documents they're writing, but we really like to have a connection with architects actually designing spaces. And I was wondering, do you already have experience in that, and how on how to include the people we're talking about when we talk about intersectional feminism in your work? And yeah, how could we design a process where we do that? That's actually my question.
I suppose that's a political process, you know, and where does consultation happen? What mode is the communication? What does it mean to pick and connect with narratives? Where will they go? Where will they circulate? So these issues come into it, and even in the I'm actually quite apprehensive of the term intersectionality because of what it's become. Not that you're using it in that way, but it kind of becomes, you know, like a badge. yet the work of doing it is really quite difficult, actually, because there's tension is at the heart of it, because of the struggles and the differences. But it's really important what you're doing, harnessing these different tensions and to think about the tensions. And within intersectionality, I think we also need to think about multi-species. This is something that's really sort of also, like Leslie said, with domestic violence in the current situation, the pandemic, but also with the pandemic, we've become, you know, our attention's changed, our senses have alerted to elements of life that we tend to just ignore or look over. And so it's also good to think about what is being, I don't know, what is being designed out by architecture? What is it designing out? And one of my latest projects in the pandemic, actually with artists, is involved lots of high-speed trains project, I call them brutalist architectures, that are cutting through ancient forests and cutting through life. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, for me, it has to be project focused, the intervention, and it can't be like a blanket, not that you're doing that, a blanket intersectional planning plan, because that in itself reproduces that kind of God's eye view of the big plan, and it needs to be situated and mobilized and kept alive in that way.
I can maybe also add to sort of the process, and I agree with Nirmal, but maybe today it's important to name specifically what groups and that I'm focusing on, rather than a sweeping idea of intersectionality, because there are certain groups, the groups that are most vulnerable change in different contexts. But another thing is also this participatory practice is something that I also I get quite nervous about in that it makes people participants, and then there's sort of this it's not clear what it is these people are getting from this participation, etc. And I usually try to think of it in terms of staging or sort of stewardship, that you invite people in, but you're very clear with what is it we're doing, who's making the decisions, what will happen, so that there's no disappointment at the end. So I think maybe to be careful with this participatory method as well.
Maybe from the point of view of Women Make the City, a quick response then, because you engage quite a lot of women from different parts of the city, different groups, to talk about long-term future plans for the city. How do you make this like an equal process of participation and interchange of ideas?
Well, it's really interesting here. Like, so we're really working in the field, you know, and so all of the work you're doing, I would love to learn more about the theories also behind intersectional feminism, because we just take it as a term to use it to explain what we do, but we really have to translate it when we work with people who are do not have scientific backgrounds. So how we describe it is that we try to achieve a city with more equal rights for everyone, despite of their gender, ability, etc., etc., etc. So all the people who join the Women Make the City movement come from those kind of, you know, are somewhere in that intersection. And when we work with them, we also try to make the the translation from the work of the planners and the city of their experiences of the city. So in all these work sessions we were doing, like you were calling participation, we were also trying to avoid that word, because it also already involves a kind of a power dynamic where one person or one party is doing something and the other can join in, So, but it's really hard, and we're really learning a lot in how to also, set rules for what kind of mandate does this Women's Advisory Board have when we are engaging in plans. So all the questions you're raising, like, we have them too, and what we're sometimes missing is to talk to people like you guys who do a lot of research on this, but also, to kind of know what is actually happening in the field of architecture. And now we're advising on a very like, how to say it, like global level, like city plans for the future of Amsterdam, or a master plan for Amsterdam Southeast, or a master plan for Amsterdam New West, where actually this week we're starting to develop a public space design method in Southeast. So to actually kind of make it more concrete, to actually start to design from their stories, from these people we're working with. But
but that's the key question, right? Because maybe it's also as Stephanie says, it's maybe not about making the right designs, but asking the right questions, and then how to implement them in the design process. Because of the time, Afaina, for you, then Lorna, you had one specific question that will be the last question, and then we have to start kind of wrapping up this conversation. Afaina, please unmute. You're muted, Afaina.
Oh, okay. I didn't know I could do that myself. Sorry. Yeah, I mean, it's great hearing all of this. At the same time, I think it's just, it's very good that you're going to do it with a really specific thing. But I also feel it's, very hard.
What is very hard to do a participatory process, or to?
Well, to do that kind of participatory process and then call it intersectional, because it's really, there's so many power dynamics, and it's just a bunch of words. But in the end, because I did that project, the project you're describing, I have done that 5 times. And it always ends up I mean, every time is different, but there's just a lot of problems you walk into, because who gets to participate, right? It's often people who actually have the means to participate and not. So that already is like, okay, so when are we going to do these sessions? Are people getting paid to be part of this session? Like who, like you say, who has mandate to make decisions? And then you take it to higher up. You finally have that design, and lots of people also are tired of being asked to participate, because they have had to do that 20 times and nothing ever comes from it. And then you finally have that design and you're going to show it to the people of the city, the urban planners. And it's like, yeah, but why should we really take this into account for these people? That's also something I've experienced a lot, that we finally made that design with, for instance, men who are labeled as like men hanging out in space. That's like a euphemistic term for Black men hanging out in space. And then you finally design that space and you take it to higher up, and it's like, yeah, but why would we make this amazing public space for these people? And then you see there's a whole power dynamic inside the city.
To conclude
where Amsterdam is gentrifying, and we're going to beautify, of course, this neighborhood that was like historically Black, for instance. But then like that beautiful design that you made, even if you get it done, for who is it actually going to be in the end? So, it's just sometimes so hard, all of these dynamics, it's hard. But I guess, what I take from the theory is that I understand parts of the dynamics that are going on, you know, and that maybe I actually have a vocabulary to point out what is going wrong or how. So yeah, maybe that is something I would really like to add to this. Sorry.
Thank you, Afaina. And also, just as to close this discussion, in the chat box, it is mentioned that the people who join the sessions are actually getting paid. So that is part of the
that's amazing.
Getting it right. Yep.
Yeah.
There's a question from Joe. Lorna left the audience.
Okay, can you hear me?
We'll skip that. Joe, but not see you.
Hello, can you hear me? Can
Yeah,
you
we
hear?
can hear you?
Okay. Actually, I wasn't going to ask a question, but I was going to say something very quickly, and to answer the Magda's question. Speaking as a person from London who practiced in London and then came to Holland, the massive contrast I see between England and the Netherlands is that in England, they don't plan. I'm talking very generally here. And in Holland, they plan the death out of everything. I'm just talking very, very quickly here. And I think what happens is when they do plan something in London or in England, almost invariably it changes, the funding gets cut, it falls apart. So there's a kind of built-in incompleteness that happens in England or in the UK that doesn't happen in Holland. And I'm incredibly, I admire incredibly the Dutch system where you do have this planning at this incredible level of planning. But what I find then is the result is sometimes that you get the sort of these terrible housing projects and they're lacking all soul because absolutely everything is resolved. And so I actually think we should design in some incompleteness in Holland. I think it would be very valuable. And what it allows, what I think it would allow would be the people that actually occupy eventually or use can fill in the spaces. And that happens in London, and that's what gives London and England this special kind of vibe. And that I find is missing in the Vinex housing sites, for example, because there isn't this space for people to fill in the gaps. So that would be one thing I would say.
Yeah, and this design of incompleteness would probably also be a very good way to blur boundaries because it opens up space for appropriation in non-designed ways.
Those incomplete pieces can be appropriated by different people at different times. But in Holland, everything is decided right to the drain cover. It's extraordinary, the level of control that happens here. It's frightening.
Afaina, before I close off and thank all the people that were taking part in this and then mention next steps, could you explain a bit more or say a bit more on how you have experienced your architect in residency and what did you learn anything from it? Did you take something from it to a next project? How has feminist practice changed for you in the meantime?
Well, I've really enjoyed collaborating and meeting a lot of new people. I have really yeah, I mean, what do I take from it? It's I don't know. I just feel like I want to bring something to it. So I just hope yeah, we all got to meet each other. I hope people are gonna take it one step further within their own practice or not. And yeah, that's about it. Yeah, thank you.
well, thank you, Afaina, for this wonderful architect in residency. You certainly brought us a lot, and also the planning community in all sorts of ways. So thank you very much. You are now officially at the end of your architect in residency. So and we have lots of proof of that. We have the podcasts that are online. We have the reading list that's online, so we can all continue educating ourselves and thinking along these new vocabulary, new ways to participate and practice our feminist practice.
And if I can say just one more thing, I would like to thank, well, Leslie, Brady, and Nirmal enormously for, I mean, just taking the time out to talk to me for these 3 podcasts. It was really so much fun. And I mean, in general, just thank you for writing those books and, you know, helping us, adding to this world of knowledge. It was just lovely to also have the 3 of you together here. So great, many thanks for that.
It definitely was. So thank you, Leslie, and good luck on your new book on gentrification. And there will definitely probably be a link to feminist practice there as well. Thank you, Brady, who will continue on this lessons for architecture students with sessions or sections on Audre Lorde and bell hooks, which is really something to look forward to, together with Afaina, as I understood correctly, and
Nirmal Puwar also.
Yeah, you're also in the list.
Like a dream team coming through.
Yeah.
Great. So Nirmal, well, that's also, you already explained about your next project, but this is definitely then one of the other very valuable projects that we look forward to. At Arcam, we have the exhibition Safe Spaces, and our next architect in resident will be Thijs de Zeeuw, who will be focusing on nature inclusivity. So a different kind of inclusivity, but also kind of a topic in architecture and design that definitely needs attention. So thank you very much, all of you in the panel, all of you in the organization of Arcam, all of you in the audience. And well, I hope to see you again on this topic or another. Thank you very much for all your time and efforts.
Thank you.
Thank you.